Thanks to both Deborah and Jeff, and certainly the American Conifer Society, all of you for hosting me today. Good afternoon to those of you that are in the Midwest and back east, and good morning to those of you that are on the West Coast. I appreciate you having me. First, I want to acknowledge my co-author, Seth Zuckerman, who's a good friend and the executive director of the organization I work for, the Northwest Natural Resource Group. This book that I co-authored with him was really his initial inspiration, and he facilitated most of the process of developing the book. So, I just had the luxury of focusing on writing and critiquing his work. Our intent with this book was to reach out to a much broader audience than we typically work with on a day-to-day basis, in particular non-forest owning folks who are nevertheless passionate about forests and want to have a more informed voice about how to conserve them. So over the next half hour or so, I'm going to share with you a bit of my background and the organization I work for, and then talk about how I interpret the evolving art and science of ecologically based forest management. And I'll also read a few excerpts from our book. I've been a forestry consultant for the better part of 25, kind of going on 30 years now, and have primarily worked with small woodland owners in the Northwest. I've been the director of forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group for over 15 years, and we're a nonprofit organization that specializes in ecologically based forest management, and we provide consulting services to forest owners, as well as research and develop new strategies for improving the conservation values of Northwest forests. And we provide a lot of education and programming and training and such. As I was starting to allude to before we got started here, my family also owns about 200 acres of forest land in Western Washington, west of the Cascades. So I tend to go from working on other folks' woods during the week to working in my own woods on the weekends. And I look at it as kind of a rather chronic merger of my vocation and avocation, but I feel fortunate that I've been able to build a career doing something that I love. So to give you a sense of what initially inspired me and informed my forest management philosophy, I want to read to you from chapter 2, which is the first chapter that I author in our book. I grew up in a very different environment than the one I've lived and worked in for the past 30 years. I was born in Minnesota in a belt of hardwood forests that stretch across the Midwest states, a forest composed of red and white oak, sugar maple, birch, and the occasional pine. Although my family lived on the outer rind of the suburbs north of the Twin Cities, we also owned 80 acres of forest land in the St. Croix River Valley, a couple hours farther north. Over the first 20 years of my life, my family frequently traveled to the woods, as we called it, and tinkered with the hardwood forest. My parents were of the Aldo Leopold School of Conservation. If you're a careful steward of the land will support you. They spent countless days planting white pine in the understory of the second-generation hardwoods, protecting the seedlings from deer browse, and eventually thinning the oaks and maples to make way for the return of the pine as it gradually eclipsed the forest canopy. We cut endless cords of firewood from the diseased red oak as it slowly expired to a root fungus that was epidemic throughout the forest. We filled water jugs from natural springs that seeped through the porous, sandy soils. Not being hunters ourselves, my dad leased the annual hunting rights to our property for the value of the annual land taxes. We cross-country skied, hiked, camped, picnicked, played, and developed an awe and appreciation for nature. Later, my dad took oak logs to a local mill and had them turned into lumber from which he made various items, including a set of heirloom quality craftsman-style living room furniture for my family. White pine was the original old growth across much of the Midwest before it was logged off to feed a growing nation, a prelude to the future of forests in the Pacific Northwest. Before my parents sold a conservation easement on their land to the Minnesota Land Trust, The crowns of the white pine they had planted for decades were just beginning to emerge from the canopy of the hardwoods, effectively restoring this original old-growth species to their plot of land. My parents eventually sold the family forest to another private owner when they moved west to live near me and reinvested in forest land near Black Diamond, Washington. When I moved west more than 25 years ago, it felt like an existential imperative that I acquire my own forest land into which I could send down roots, make sense of this world, and pursue the endless fascination of tinkering in the woods. In 1995, my sweetie and I purchased our first tract of land, what I now refer to as our homestead property, just south of Oakville, Washington. I had just enough college tuition money left over after graduating to make the down payment on the land, something unheard of today. Like a forced savings plan, we put every spare penny we earned into paying it off. Our Oakville forest sits at the northern terminus of the Willapa Hills, a massive series of ancient submarine clay ripples. If you scramble down the deeply incised seasonal stream drainages on the north side of the hills, you will find a horizon of sedimentary soil choked with seashells, evidence of the era when these antediluvian marine terraces were submerged beneath saltwater. Over eons of subduction, the Juan de Fuca plate ground its way beneath the North American plate, shoving the current shoreline up out of the ocean, exposing the marine terraces and setting into motion the ecological succession that led to some of the most biomass-dense forests our planet has ever known, second only to the redwood forests of Northern California. The old growth is long gone. My family's Black Diamond and Oakville forests and a third forest we recently purchased near Bakota, Washington, now support a third generation of trees composed largely of young Douglas fir and red alder. Ghosts of the former old growth still linger in the shadows of our woods in the form of massive stumps and down logs, but these have nearly faded to nothingness and require a keen eye to find. Restoring the structure, habitat, and character of the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest is one of my family's missions, and in so doing, we will generate periodic dividend checks by thinning trees from the 200-acre forest investment we've made. However, to quote a common saying in the world of restoration ecology, the desired future condition is not the past. My family is not endeavoring to manage our forest back to a historical condition. Instead, by looking to historical and current old-growth forests as examples, we're using principles of ecological forestry to manage our forests forward into a new climate that may not support the same assemblages of plant species that existed historically, and forward into a condition that we hope will provide a sustained supply of high-quality forest products and a rich panoply of ecosystem services such as wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, and biodiversity. So, as I alluded to in the latter part of this story, one focus of ecological forestry is the restoration of older forest functions and structures within younger forests. But why is this important? This map shows the distribution of forest cover by age throughout the lower Puget Sound region, where I live here in Western Washington. And if you look for forests that are over 150 years old, and these are the darker green polygons that you might be able to see if you squint hard enough at your screen, you'll see that there's very little remaining. We'll find some, see if I can get a pointer going. We'll find some around Fort Lewis, interestingly, a large military base down in the South Sound. A little bit here along the southeast edge of the Olympic Mountains. And then you'll see a kind of a scatter shot of older forests in the foothills of the Cascade Range. However, by some counts, we've cut nearly 95% of the original old-growth forests that once cloaked this region and converted them to other uses, largely homogeneous timber plantations. So I find it a sobering fact that more than 50% of the forests in the Pacific Northwest are less than 40 years old, and approximately 75% of the forests are less than 100 years old. So although I don't have anything against young single species plantations in and of themselves, I would argue that they represent a dramatically overrepresented forest habitat type on the landscape. And to quote Andy Carey, one of the godfathers of the science of ecological forestry, a professor of forestry at the University of Washington, quote, "The Pacific Northwest is suffering from a Douglas fir epidemic, and we don't necessarily need more of this habitat type." A friend of mine recently sent me this tagline that followed the signature in an email she received from an individual who works for a timber company. And now, aside from the advocacy of wanton wastefulness, I think the claim that we have more trees in the US today than we did 100 years ago is incredibly misleading. Converting a modestly stocked old growth forest to a highly stocked plantation now may net more trees per acre, but there are few ecological equivalencies. And I want to share with you some of the functional qualities of older forests that make them unique relative to their younger counterparts. And let's start with carbon. Older forests are superior at sequestering carbon over long periods of time and maintaining that carbon in a much more stable fashion than younger forests. A forest in the Northwest that's just 100 years old, hardly qualifying as old growth, will have more than twice the amount of carbon per acre than a young 40-year-old plantation that's first coming of age to be clear cut. And we conducted a growth and yield modeling exercise a couple of years ago where we took a newly established plantation of Douglas fir and managed it over a 160-year time frame using 4 different silvicultural methods to look at the differences in carbon sequestration. And as you see in this graph, the scenario that performed the worst, which is the green line at the bottom there, is the one where the stand was clear cut every 40 years, which is kind of a standard industrial rotation here in the Pacific Northwest. The scenario that performed second to worst was the one where we grew the stand out to 80 years with one thinning at 40 years and then clear cut. In the third scenario, we thinned the same stand every 20 years, but never clear cut. And then in the final scenario, we just left the stand to grow without any management whatsoever. And you'll see that at least from this modeling exercise, that's the one that performed the best. And what I find compelling about the results of this model is that the stand that was thinned every 20 years performed just about as good as the stand that was left to grow under no management. However, I want to circle back to the consequences of no management in a moment. Older forests moderate watershed hydrology and both retain more water and release it more slowly than younger forests. We recently worked with the Environmental Protection Agency to model watershed hydrology in the Mayshell River watershed, which is a tributary to the Nisqually River here in the Northwest. And at the headwaters of this river sits the Nisqually Community Forest, a 6,000 acre forest that's been brought back under local ownership and management, and for which I and my organization are the forester. And the modeling is showing that when you grow the average age of forests in this particular watershed to over 100 years, the landscape is able to retain significantly more water and release it much later in the summer, which is critical for the needs of salmon. Older forests provide habitat structures that are largely missing in younger forests, such as large snags and down logs and canopy complexity. Studies of old growth forests, interestingly, on both the east and west side of the Cascade Mountains, have shown that they can contain up to 90 snags per and down logs per acre, whereas younger third, fourth generation plantations typically contain few or none altogether.
Kirk, can I
Yes,
interrupt for a second? Because there's a very timely question
sure.
referencing the carbon sequestration that you talked about And I think there would like to know about what assumptions went into that calculation when you were
Sure.
modeling the future.
Yeah. So what we looked at were three pools of carbon. Carbon that stays in the forest when you harvest, carbon that goes into what they call, long-lived forest products, 2x4s, what have you, building materials, and then carbon that goes into the waste stream. So we used an open source forest modeling program developed by the Forest Service called the Forest Vegetation Simulator, or FVS, and basically plugged in a theoretical Douglas fir plantation stocked at standard 350 trees per acre on an average site class here in the Northwest, and then again grew that theoretical stand out, and utilize or program the model using those four different silvicultural scenarios to see then how carbon interacted, on those three different pools of carbon interacted under those different scenarios. So I hope that that explains it.
Thank you.
Yep. Continuing to talk about some of the ecosystem services of older forests, looking at biodiversity. Older forests host unique assemblages of plants and animals and other biota, many of which are still being discovered. Some of you might be familiar with the research that was conducted by Dr. Nalini Nadkarni that revealed unique plant and wildlife communities in the canopies of older forests. She did these studies both in the Pacific Northwest and down in the tropics, and found that forests that have very complex canopies support a wide range of unique biota up in that complex canopy structure. And then, of course, timber production. Older forests both produce more timber over time and higher quality timber products. Back to some of our modeling exercises, we also did a modeling exercise that showed that growing forests out to 80 years of age with two commercial thinnings in between, as compared to clear cutting twice at 40 years, produce 50% more timber volume and higher quality and value timber in the larger saw logs and tighter grain saw logs. So people often ask why we can't just leave nature to our own design and allow forests to naturally recover over time. And my main argument against passive conservation is that as younger forests go through the process of recovery, they pass through this phase of extreme vulnerability. They're often overstocked and in a highly competitive phase of growth that is susceptible to catastrophic loss due to any number of natural disturbance events, such as fire or disease or insect pests or blowdown during storms. So we have two roads diverging in the woods. Do we actively manage forests in order to restore the ecosystem services they provide, or do we just let nature run its course? And so at this point, I'd like to bring in my co-author's voice by reading the first part of chapter 1, titled, "What is Ecological Forestry and Why Does It Matter?" Ecological forestry seems like it ought to be a redundancy, like soil-based farming or love-based marriage. If there's anything we've learned about forests in recent decades, it's that forests are more than just crowds of trees, just as oceans are more than big ponds of saltwater dotted with schools of fish. As a result, any reasonable strategy to care for or manage a forest must take its interconnectedness into account. That is the core meaning of ecological, considering the trees as part of a holistic system in which the countless component parts affect and even depend on one another. We encounter all kinds of interactions in a forest, starting with the most basic, species nibbling on one another or eating each other whole. They sometimes compete for light, water, and nutrients, while in other cases they cooperate and share resources. They parasitize one another and nest or take shelter in nooks and crannies of habitat that other species have created. Ultimately, a crew of decomposers swoops in to consume them in death. In this way, the distinct species add up to a greater whole, like the instruments in a symphony. If you think of forest managers as the conductors of that symphony, ecological forestry means paying attention to the strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion, all with equal concern. Imagine if you were the conductor and you focused only on the strings section. The composition would sound pretty dissonant, and the concert hall would empty out in short order. But enlist all the instruments and you can create a thing of beauty. That's the framework we adopt in this book, to care for the forest as an organic whole, taking our cues from natural processes already at work. Our goal is to influence those processes so they provide the forest and ourselves with what we need, recognizing that there is still much for us to learn about how the forest functions. The rewards of this approach are as diverse as the forest itself. Forests give so much to humanity, starting with their role in providing clean, reliable water. From roots to canopy, they protect the soil and keep it from eroding, and thereby muddying the streams that flow through the woods. Forest soils and even the tree crowns absorb some of the rain that falls on the landscape and slow its release into the streams below, reducing the magnitude of floods in the wet season and extending runoff later into the summer. Finally, they moderate the temperature of creeks and rivers that traverse the forest both by shading them and through evapotranspiration, keeping the water cool for salmon, salamanders, and other cold water-loving creatures. The watersheds that supply many cities drinking water, including in our area, Seattle, Tacoma, Bellingham, and Portland, are all covered in well-managed forests, which protect the quality of the water for these municipalities. Care about wildlife? Forests shelter innumerable species of mammals, birds, and amphibians, not to mention less charismatic creatures such as insects and mollusks, as well as life forms yet unknown to science. Some of those animals find the food, cover, or habitat they need only in forests that have reached a certain age. Perhaps they need to excavate their nests in dead trees of a certain minimum size, or build their nests in a tree that has developed the complexity and broken tops that only occur in older forests. Others need the accumulation of down logs that hold moisture through the summer or provide the shelter against predators. Ecological forestry doesn't ignore the timber that can be harvested from the forest. As the timber industry is fond of saying, wood is one of the most environmentally sound construction materials, an assertion we agree with, so long as the wood comes from well-managed forests. In many cases, the harvested timber would be the most valuable source of income that the forest generates, making the harvest of trees crucial to maintaining the land in its forested condition and paying for its upkeep. The key is to start by asking how much timber the forest can afford to give, not how much its human stewards wish to take. So it should come as no surprise by now that I and my organization are strong advocates of actively managing forests in order to restore their ecosystem functions. As I alluded to earlier, the vast majority of forests we're working with are younger and typically very dense. Therefore, one of the first and most important strategies of ecological forestry is thinning, or the gradual reduction of tree density through cutting and or harvesting trees. But why is that important? So allow me to put some numbers into perspective. Whenever I hike in the old growth forests of the Northwest, whether they're on the coast or up in the Olympic Mountains or the Cascade Mountains, when I stick my thumb up and measure the number of old growth trees within a given area, the stocking nearly always falls between 25 to 100 trees per acre, and often to the lower end of that stocking density. However, most younger forests, whether planted or naturally regenerated, typically host more than 400 trees per acre, or 4 to 16 times the carrying capacity of a site for large old trees. Therefore, the practice of ecological forestry emphasizes thinning and, in fact, multiple thinnings over time in order to reduce competition within younger forests, adjust species composition, and ultimately improve the resilience and productivity and ecosystem services that forests can provide. And when we thin forests, we can utilize numerous strategies gleaned from observations of natural forest developmental processes. For instance, We can create small gaps that simulate pockets of disease or wind disturbances and open the canopy to support other tree and shrub species. And when we create these gaps at higher elevations, and these photos are from the Nisqually Community Forest, which is about 3,500 feet. They're up in the snow zone in the Cascade Mountains. These gaps accumulate more snow and release that moisture longer into the spring. And this is an aerial shot of some of these small gaps. These are only anywhere from a quarter to at most an acre in size, and are contrasted by the large clear cuts in the background that can be 40, 60, or 100 acres in size. Creating these gaps also provide the opportunity to plant additional species of trees that may be underrepresented in a particular forest. We've also begun experimenting with a strategy referred to as assisted migration, whereby we plant seedlings from more southerly latitudes that are genetically adapted to a warmer climate. When we thin, we can create wildlife habitat structures that are missing in younger forests, such as constructed logs that emulate some of the functions of large old growth logs that are now missing, and also create habitat piles, also providing similar ecological and habitat functions. We can, as part of our commercial thinning strategies, we always ask our skidder operators to take the slash and redistribute it back into the forest. That gets that biomass back onto forest soils and decomposing. And we also ask them to periodically just drop bundles of slash as habitat structures in the forest. We also ask them to take some of the pulp logs, the low value trees out of the forest, and stack them in parallel like this, again, to create artificial down logs on the forest floor. During
Kirk,
thinning, nope,
excuse me, just one
yep,
second, Kirk. This is a great question. I think a lot of people would want to know. When you
bet.
create those gaps, do more invasives enter?
That's definitely a possibility. Sure, whenever you open the forest canopy, you've got kind of a combined effect here. Opening the forest canopy, getting more sunlight to the forest floor, and then using mechanical harvesting, which disturbs the forest floor, creating an exposed mineral soil. Two things can happen in that case. Certainly, if there are invasive species within proximity of that gap, or if there's a latent seed bank in that soil, that can create opportunities for invasive species. It also creates opportunities for natural regeneration. Other tree species that are less shade tolerant can regenerate in those open gaps. And then we also get a much greater diversity of shrubs and understory species that don't prosper underneath a closed forest canopy. So it's kind of a balancing act there, but we definitely need to monitor those sites for invasive species and certainly address those as they come up. But yes, that's a great question. And during this thinning process, we can also adjust the species composition. And I was talking a little bit earlier before we got started about some of the die-off that we're seeing in the Northwest of the less drought-tolerant species. For us, that's western hemlock and cedar. And so where those species regenerate on drought-prone soils, then during the thinning process, we can proactively remove those and favor the more drought-tolerant species, as well as by thinning, just reduce the demands for soil moisture. We can also release underrepresented species, such as hardwoods or western red cedar, in order to increase biodiversity. And then we can also increase a forest's resilience to fire by growing larger and more fire-resistant trees. And then lastly, by extending the rotation age at which we finally cut trees, we can both, again, as I mentioned earlier, grow more timber volume and sequester more carbon. So I'd like to close my presentation now with two final readings. And the first one is one of my favorite wildlife anecdotes from my own family's forest. One of my favorite personal wildlife stories took place a few years ago when George the Curious Grouse took up residence on my family's land near Bakota. George was a fearless grouse with a lot of attitude and was clearly not smitten with my family, nor impressed by our efforts to manage our forest. What George lacked in smarts, he made up for in bravery. He routinely attempted to attack the business end of my brush cutter when I began cutting blackberries. He relentlessly pecked at the cuff of my mother's pants as she planted tree seedlings. He also assaulted my son, although this at least was justified, as my son wanted to see what would happen if he poked George with a sharp stick. I considered capturing and relocating George after he attacked a Natural Resource Conservation Service agent upon exiting his truck. Fortunately, this event didn't disqualify me for Environmental Quality Incentives Program funding. For weeks, George greeted us nearly every time we entered our land, and we eventually named the small valley he occupied Grouseland. One day, when George made his appearance, we noticed he was missing his right leg. We all wondered what altercation led to this alteration, and whether his opponent fared worse. The missing appendage didn't diminish George's feisty attitude, and he continued to defend his territory with unmitigated zeal. Eventually, George disappeared altogether, and we've often wondered what fate befell him. I'm not sure there's a moral to this story, and I certainly don't want any of you to fear being accosted by wildlife should you improve habitat on your land. Perhaps the message is to walk softly and carry a big stick, but not a pointy one. And then finally, I'll close by reading the afterword written by my co-author, Seth Zuckerman. Throughout this book, we've shared a lot of specific ideas about caring for your forest and how it can be a source of food and firewood, financial gain, and personal fulfillment. And sure, those details are important. They encompass the day-to-day routine of caring for your forest and being nurtured by it in return. Looking after a forest is a practice, and it's important to do it well. But ecological forestry is more than just a way to grow timber and build a private trail network for you and your friends. When you step back to take in the bigger picture, it is a way to re-engage with nature and restore a connection that has been weakened over centuries of modern industrial civilization and postmodern digital distraction. Through the last half century, this drive has taken many forms. Backyard gardeners have stuck their hands in the soil and turned the compost in an effort to make the earth say beans instead of grass, in the words of Thoreau. River restorationists have learned about their watersheds and worked to make them hospitable to salmon again. We happen to feel drawn to forests, and that's why we have made them our entry point to this practice of reestablishing a right relationship with nature. A connection with nature cannot be had in the abstract, nor can it be had with the totality of nature, or at least we confess that we are not skilled enough to pull that off. Rather, it occurs in a specific place through actions of reciprocal caretaking. My mentor in watershed restoration, Freeman House, used to say before partaking of a salmon that its presence on our plates was a sign that we are still welcome on the planet. You could say the same thing about a chanterelle, the delicious fruiting body of a fungus that grows in partnership with a stand of trees, or even about a 2x4. These all emerge from the earth in forests that have been shaped by human management. So they are in some way the fruit of our stewardship, however neglectful, misguided, or careless our efforts have been. Whether through intention or accident, finesse or blunder, we've made the earth say mushroom or lumber instead of grass. These gifts of the forest are what we draw from that relationship, as in any reciprocal relationship. The question is what we render in return. Ecological forestry offers this answer: mindful stewardship of the forest, taking account of all its parts. That's the principle. All else is commentary. The details will no doubt change and evolve as attentive forest stewards learn more about how life forms of the forest interact with one another and their biophysical setting. In a decade or two, some of what we have recommended here may turn out to be mistaken, overgeneralized, or too prescriptive, but we are confident that the fundamental principle will still endure. And now, its implementation is left as an exercise for the reader. Put your boots on and get outside.
Thank you so
And
much.
thank you, folks. And if you are interested in our book, you can order it through a local bookstore. You can certainly go onto our website as well and find different avenues there to purchase it. And yeah, with that, I'll conclude and would love to open it up for conversation, questions, anecdotes, wherever you want to go from here.
And you guys can unmute yourself or open your video up to chat with Kirk and ask some questions now. I think this material is fascinating today because, you know, the plants we collect and adore, they come out of growth like this. So I guess I'll ask a question while we wait for others. Have you ever found any brooms up high in the tree canopy that you were able to collect and propagate? Can you tell us about that?
Oh, well, I think, yeah, what you're maybe referring to, God, now I'm completely blanking on
An
the,
aberration or a growth that will become a completely new plant if harvested and propagated?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, what I'm thinking of is mistletoe. When you mentioned brooms up in the forest canopy, we do have a parasitic species called mistletoe. It's more common up at higher elevations or in eastern Washington than it is in western Washington. But in this case, since it's parasitic, it oftentimes is fatal to the tree host that it's growing in. So we, from a silvicultural standpoint, usually try to eliminate it. It depends on the objectives of the forest owner. It also can create habitat structures for wildlife. So, but I'm not sure if that's entirely what you're referring to.
No, but that's interesting because you have to look up there to see it, and I don't know how you would get it down from the height of some of these trees, but
Yeah, it's more we take the tree out in its entirety that has that parasite in it.
you don't have a cherry picker that tall.
No. So somebody asks, have you been influenced by Elder Leopold and Robin Wall Kimmerer? I'm not familiar with the last name, Robin Wall Kimmerer, but Elder Leopold, absolutely. As I shared at the beginning of my presentation, I consider my parents, who brought me up within a context of forest stewardship, to be greatly influenced by Elder Leopold. I mean, they had his classic book, A Sand County Almanac, on their bookshelf growing up. I didn't read until I was, in my later 20s or so, and getting into the study of ecology. But once I understood Elder Leopold's, basic conservation ethic, again, if you actively steward the land, care for the land, and the land cares for you, it was very much my parents' attitude and approach to forest management. That clearly made a deep impression on me in my early years, and has led to and informed my practice of forestry consulting here in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, any other questions? And I certainly would be open to folks sharing anecdotes as well from their own forest. Let's see. I have a Sugam not really good at the last. Oops, it just popped off here. Let's see. That is.
Suga mertensiana.
There we go. This is from Grace, who's in Eastern Washington, planting residential Eastern Washington, drier and hotter in summer than Western Washington. I'm not sure on what to expect on size and placement with sun shade. Any info on how this would behave or what to expect in my area? All I really find online is that they grow slower and can take more sun than most sugas. I planted it sort of under a Doug fir. Is that a mistake or should I move it? Oh, mountain hemlock, right? Okay, yeah, I didn't recognize it right away there since I don't come across a whole lot of mountain hemlock. They tend to be at quite higher elevations than I work with. That's a good question. Mountain hemlock is very shade tolerant. It is quite drought tolerant given the elevation that it grows at. I would think it would do fairly well in Eastern Washington where you have, a cold climate, and it's drier. I think you did well by planting it, underneath the Douglas fir again, since it is shade tolerant. That's can provide a little more of a benign environment for it. Yeah, I don't think you'd want to have it growing at full exposure over there. Although when you get up above 4,000 feet elevation, which is the mountain hemlock zone, you get pure stands mountain hemlock, so they are growing in full sun. But, if you're planting at a lower elevation, kind of changing the microclimate, you definitely need to provide some, mitigating measures. So again, I think, having it growing in partial shade is, should be fine. Yeah, and you say you're about 1,800 feet elevation. I'm all for the science project. On my Oakville land, I've got all different species, even eastern hardwoods growing there. I love the kind of practice of managing an arboretum just to see what does well. I mentioned before we got started, this weekend, or likely next weekend after we get through this cold snap, I'm going to be planting coast redwoods in my forest that aren't native to the Pacific Northwest, but grow very well here. So I'm going to be planting them out in all different microclimates at my forest in Oakville just to see how they do. So um, I think it's a great experiment. Yeah, any other questions or comments or anecdotes? And you can either put it in the chat or you can unmute and
Well, I have a question. I live in Southwest Washington, outside of Castle Rock.
sure.
And, I just have a small piece of property. So my question to you is, for those of us who just have small amount of land, I have 2.5 acres. What can you recommend in terms of raising a forest or, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, even at, 2.5 acres or smaller, I think you've got a lot of opportunities. What I always come back to is, what are your values? What are your goals and objectives? As you probably can gather, most of the people that I work with and that come to me and my organization, are interested in restoring, conserving, the ecological values of their forests. They're more conservation minded. So they want to restore wildlife habitat, improve carbon sequestration, have a beautiful forest, just aesthetics. So I think even at a smaller acreage, I would be looking at what are all the diverse plants that you can be growing there, from ground covers to shrubs to low trees to then, the canopy trees, and try to recreate, if it's not already, if your forest isn't already there, creating that complex canopy that's comprised of all the different tree and shrub plant species that are suitable for your site. And I think that last point is critically important. You want to look at your soils, and are they droughty? Are they glacial till or sand? Or are they loamy where they retain more moisture? That'll tell you what kind of trees and shrubs will do well there. What's your aspect? Are you south-facing, high up in a hill slope? Are you on a north-facing aspect, shadier, cooler? Are you down at the bottom of a hill where the soils might be wetter? Knowing your microclimate also will help inform what kind of plants will do best on your site. And once you understand your microclimate like that, then there's any number of tools online. And here in Washington, King County has a great plant finder that you can plug these different variables in, full sun, wet soils, wildlife plants, and it will spit out a list of tree and shrub species. So, I'd look at something like that. And then also look at some of the habitat structures. And if your house is on your property, you may not want to have, standing dead trees next to it that provide cavities for wildlife. So as an alternative, you can put up nesting boxes for birds or small mammals. You can put up bat boxes. If you are thinning any trees, again, leaving some of the logs on the ground to rot and provide habitat for amphibians and insects that are at the beginning of the food chain, are all important things to do for wildlife. So yeah, all sorts of options. And in our book, we do talk quite a bit about backyard forestry, what you can do on a small scale. Our Department of Fish and Wildlife here in Washington has a great website on backyard wildlife management or backyard forestry. So I'd encourage you just to, put that into the search engine of your computer and see what comes up.
What species besides hemlock would we consider under canopy? I think a lot of us have gardens or small acreage that is kind of designed and planted. And when we want to add more, one of the things we struggle with is how much sun. So I know hemlock is an under canopy, and you've mentioned that today. Are there any other species that across the country might be appropriate and are considered more of conifer that are considered more under canopy?
Well, even though I grew up in Minnesota, it's been so long ago, I've kind of lost my familiarity with a lot of the species back there. I know, in the hardwood forests, this kind of uneven age management is much more common because there are a lot of hardwoods that are that regenerate in the shade. But it's a little more difficult for me to address species outside of my own region. Within the Northwest, though, we've got a fairly broad range of both conifer and hardwoods that are shade tolerant. For us, beyond western hemlock, Sitka spruce, grand fir, Abies grandis. Let's see, western red cedar, Pacific yew. Those are all conifers that are shade tolerant. And even Douglas fir and white pine are partially shade tolerant, depending on how porous your canopy is. You can oftentimes get away with those. For hardwoods, for us, again, in the Northwest, big leaf maple. Excuse me, for understory trees, cascara, hazelnut are all species that are shade tolerant. So yeah, for folks that I think are interested again in diversifying the understory of their forest, I would just look at the region that you're in. And of course, it's always amazing how much information you can find online. I would just plug in shade tolerant trees in Minnesota or in West Virginia or wherever you happen to live and see what's there. And like I mentioned earlier, when Sarah asked, not only do you want to know what would be shade tolerant in that case, but what will your soils support and what tree species are either drought tolerant or moisture preferring, depending on your soils. And if you're not familiar with it, the Natural Resource Conservation Service has a great online website called the Web Soil Survey, and you can plug in the address for your land. Or just navigate on a map to where your land is located and then pull up an enormous amount of information on your soils. And they will often, if you navigate into it far enough, find a list of tree and shrub species that historically were endemic to your particular soil type. So that can be really useful.
Okay, that's helpful to me. I think I need to do a lot more research.
Let's see, Grace asked, any thoughts on that huge bog in Washington that I think was more recently discovered? Landed on a video about it. There seems to be a lot of importance put on it. What role does it play in conservation? I have no idea, Grace. I've never heard about it. If you can find that website or a link to that video or something and put that in the chat, that's news to me. I haven't heard about it.
Any other questions for Kirk? Maybe not Kirk.
That's okay.
Grace did give you the link there.
Yeah, that's great. All right, let me click on that before we
Sounds like a
log
sinkhole.
in. Yeah. All right.
Well, Kirk, thank you so much. This has been a lot of food for thought and real food. So thank you very, very much.
Absolutely. Again, appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. You can go to our website if you want to find more information on our organization. We've got if you are a small woodland owner, and in the Northwest, we also have a lot of information on small woodlands management on our website as well. And My contact information is there if you ever want to reach out. Happy to chat with you. So, yeah, again, thanks, Deborah, and thank you to the American Conifer Society for hosting me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all.
Okay. And hey, everybody, don't forget about checking out and thinking about your sign up for the national conference in Rock Island, Illinois, that starts June 19th. The sign up is going very well. And we hope that more of you sign up because it's going to be a great program with mostly private gardens plus a VIP tour at Bickelhop. I think it's going to be a really, really exciting conference, not to mention the silent and live auction, which is, whoa, that's what I like. So hope to meet a lot more of you at the national conference this year. I guess with that, we're going to say goodbye.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks,
bye,
folks.
Kirk.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
You bet.